chapters 17 and 18 of The Angel of Terror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This reading by Allison Hester of Athens, Georgia. The Angel of Terror by Edgar Wallace. Chapter 17. Lydia had plenty to occupy her days. The house in Curzon Street had been bought, and she had been a round of furnishers, paper hangers, and fitters of all variety. The trip to the Riviera came at the right moment. She could leave Mrs. Morgan in charge and come back to her new home, which was to be ready in 2 months. Amongst other things, the problem of the watchful Mr. Jaggs would be settled automatically. She spoke to him that night when he came. "By the way, Mr. Jaggs, I am going to the south of France next week." "A pretty place by all accounts," volunteered Mr. Jaggs. "A lovely place by all accounts," repeated Lydia with a smile. "And you're going to have a holiday, Mr. Jaggs. By the way, what am I to pay you?" "The gentleman pays me, miss," said Mr. Jaggs with a sniff. "The lawyer gentleman." "Well, he must continue paying you whilst I am away," said the girl. "I am very grateful to you, and I want to give you a little present before I go. Is there anything you would like, Mr. Jaggs?" Mr. Jaggs rubbed his beard, scratched his head, and thought he would like a pipe. "No, bless you, miss, I don't want any present." "You shall have the best pipe I can buy," said the girl. "It seems very inadequate." "I'd rather have a briar, miss," said old Jaggs mistakenly. He was on duty until the morning she left, and although she rose early he had gone. She was disappointed, for she had not given him the handsome case of pipes she had bought, and she wanted to thank him. She felt she had acted rather meanly towards him. She owed her life to him twice. "Didn't you see him go?" she asked Mrs. Morgan. "No, miss." The stout housekeeper shook her head. "I was up at 6 and he'd gone then, but he left his chair in the passage. I've got an idea that's where he slept, miss, if he slept at all." "Poor old man," said the girl gently. "I haven't been very kind to him, have I? And I do owe him such a lot." "Maybe he'll turn up again," said Miss Morgan hopefully. She had the mother feeling for the old, which is one of the beauties of her class, and she regretted Lydia's absence probably as much because it would entail the disappearance of old Jaggs as for the loss of her mistress. But old Jaggs did not turn up. Lydia hoped to see him at the station, hovering on the outskirts of the crowd in his furtive way, but she was disappointed. She left by the 11 o'clock train, joining Mrs. Cole-Mortimer on the station. The lady had arranged to spend a day in Paris, and the girl was not sorry, after a somewhat bad crossing of the English Channel, that she had not to continue her journey through the night. The south of France was to be a revelation to her. She had no conception of the extraordinary change of climate and vegetation that could be experienced in one country. She passed from a drizzly, bedraggled Paris into a land of sunshine and gentle breezes, from the bare, sullen lands of the Champagne into a country where flowers grew by the side of the railway, and that in February, to a semi-tropic land, fragrant with flowers, to white beaches by a blue lazy sea and a sky over all unflecked by the clouds. It took her breath away, the beauty of it, and the sense and genial warmth of it. The trees laden with lemons, the wisteria on the walls, the white dust on the road, and the glory of the golden mimosa that scented the air with its rare and lovely perfume. They left the train at Nice and drove along the Grand Corniche. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had a call to make in Monte Carlo, and the girl sat back in the car and drank in the beauty of this delicious spot, whilst her hostess interviewed the house agent. Surely the place must be kept under glass. It looked so fresh and clean and free from stain. The casino disappointed her. It was a place of plaster and stucco, and did not seem built for permanent use. They drove back part of the way they had come, on to the peninsula of Cap Martin, and she had a glimpse of beautiful villas between the pines and queer little roads that led into mysterious dells. Presently the car drew up before a good-looking house. Even Mrs. Cole-Mortimer was surprised into an expression of her satisfaction at the sight of it. Lydia, who thought that this was Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's own demesne, was delighted. "You were lucky to have a beautiful home like this, Mrs. Cole-Mortimer," she said. "It must be heavenly living here." The habit of wealth had not been so well acquired that she could realize that she also could have a beautiful house if she wished. She thought of that later. Nor did she expect to find Jean Briggerland there, and Mr. Briggerland, too, sitting on a big cane chair on the veranda overlooking the sea and smoking a cigar of peace. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer had been very careful to avoid all mention of Jean on the journey. "Didn't I tell you they would be here?" she said in careless amazement. "Why, of course. Dear Jean left 2 days before we did. It makes such a nice little party. Do you play bridge?" Lydia did not play bridge, but was willing to be taught. She spent the remaining hour of daylight exploring the grounds which led down to the road which fringed the sea. She could look across at the lights already beginning to twinkle at Monte Carlo, to the white yachts lying off Monaco, and farther along the coast to a little cluster of lights that stood for Beaulieu. "It is glorious," she said, drawing a long breath. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer, who had accompanied her in her stroll, purred the purr of the pleased patron whose protégé has been thankful for favors received. Dinner was a gay meal, for Jean was in her brightest mood. She had a keen sense of fun, and her sly little sallies, sometimes aimed at her father, sometimes at Lydia's expense, but more often directed at people in the social world, whose names or household words, kept Lydia in a constant gurgle of laughter. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer alone was nervous and ill at ease. She had learned unpleasant news, and was not sure whether she should tell the company or keep her secret to herself. In such dilemma weak people take the most sensational course, and presently she dropped her bombshell. "Celeste says that the gardener's little boy has a malignant smallpox case," she wailed. Jean was telling a funny story to the girl who sat by her, and did not pause for so much as a second in her narrative. The effect on Mr. Briggerland was, however, wholly satisfactory to Mrs. Cole-Mortimer. He pushed back his chair and blinked at his hostess. "Smallpox!" he said in horror. "Here in Cap Martin? Good God! Did you hear that, Jean?" "Did I hear what?" she asked lazily. "About the gardener's little boy? Oh, yes. There has been quite an epidemic on the Italian Riviera. In fact, they closed the frontier last week." But here," spluttered Briggerland. Lydia could only look at him in open-eyed amazement. The big man's terror was pitiably apparent. The copper skin had turned a dirty gray. His lower lip was trembling like a frightened child's. "Why not here?" asked Jean coolly. "There's nothing to be scared about. Have you been vaccinated recently?" She turned to the girl, and Lydia shook her head. "Not since I was a baby, and then I believe the operation was not a success." "Anyway, the child is isolated in the cottage, and they are taking him to Nice tonight," said Jean. "Poor little fellow. Even his own mother has deserted him. Are you going to the casino?" she asked. "I don't know," replied Lydia. "I'm very tired, but I should love to go." "Take her, father, and you go, Margaret. By the time you return, the infection will be removed." "Won't you come too?" asked Lydia. "No, I'll stay at home tonight. I turned my ankle today, and it is rather stiff. Father!" This time her voice was sharp, menacing almost, thought Lydia, and Mr. Briggerland made a heroic attempt to recover his self-possession. "Certainly, my dear. I shall be delighted. Delighted." He saw her alone whilst Lydia was changing in her lovely big dressing room overlooking the sea. "Why didn't you tell me there was smallpox in Cap Martin?" he demanded fretfully. "Because I didn't know till Margaret relieved her mind at our expense," said his daughter coolly. "I had to say something. Besides, I'd heard one of the maids say that somebody's mother had deserted him. I fitted it in. What a funk you are, father!" "I hate the very thought of disease," he growled. "Why aren't you coming with us? There is nothing the matter with your ankle." "Because I prefer to stay at home." He looked at her suspiciously. "Jean," he said in a milder voice, "hadn't we better let up on the girl for a bit, until that lunatic doctor affair has blown over?" She reached out and took a gold case from his waistcoat pocket, extracted a cigarette, and replaced the case before she spoke. "We can't afford to 'let up,' as you call it, for a single hour. Do you realize that any day her lawyer may persuade her to make a will leaving her money to a home for cats, or something equally untouchable? If there was no Jack Glover, we could afford to wait months. And I'm less troubled about him than I am that man Jaggs. Father, you will be glad to learn I am almost afraid of that freakish old man." "Neither of them are here," he began. "Exactly," said Jean. "Neither are here. Lydia had a telegram from him just before dinner asking if he could come to see her next week." At this moment Lydia returned, and Jean Briggerland eyed her critically. "My dear, you look lovely," she said, and kissed her. Mr. Briggerland's nose wrinkled, as it always did when his daughter shocked him. Chapter 18. Jean Briggerland waited until she heard the sound of the departing car sink to a faint hum. Then she went up to her room, opened the bureau, and took out a long and tightly fitting dust coat that she wore when she was motoring. She had seen a large bottle of peroxide in Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's room. It probably contributed to the dazzling glories of Mrs. Cole-Mortimer's hair, but it was also a powerful germicide. She soaked a big silk handkerchief in a basin of water, to which she added a generous quantity of the drug, and, squeezing the handkerchief nearly dry, she knotted it loosely about her neck. A rubber bathing cap she had pulled down over her head, and smiled at her queer reflection in the glass. Then she found a pair of kid gloves and drew them on. She turned out the light and went softly down the carpeted stairs. The servants were at their dinner, and she opened the front door and crossed the lawn into a belt of trees, beyond which she knew, for she had been in the house 2 days, was the gardener's cottage. A dim light burned in one of the 2 rooms, and the window was uncurtained. She saw the bed and its tiny occupant, but nobody else was in the room. The maid had said that the mother had deserted the little sufferer, but this was not quite true. The doctor had ordered the mother into isolation, and had sent a nurse from the infection hospital to take her place. That lady at the moment was waiting at the end of the avenue for the ambulance to arrive. Jean opened the door and stepped in, pulling up the saturated handkerchief until it covered nose and mouth. The place was deserted, and without a moment's hesitation she lifted the child, wrapped a blanket about it, and crossed the lawn again. She went quietly up the stairs straight to Lydia's room. There was enough light from the dressing room to see the bed, and, unwrapping the blanket, she pulled back the covers and laid him gently in the bed. The child was unconscious. The hideous marks of the disease had developed with remarkable rapidity, and he made no sound. She sat down in a chair, waiting. Her almost inhuman calm was not ruffled by so much as a second's apprehension. She had provided for every contingency, and was ready with a complete explanation whatever happened. Half an hour passed, and then, rising, she wrapped the child in the blanket and carried him back to the cottage. She heard the purr of the motor and footsteps as she fitted back through the trees. First, she went to Lydia's room and straightened the bed, spraying the room with the faint perfume which she found on the dressing table. Then she went back again into the garden, stripped off the dust coat, cap, and handkerchief, rolling them into a bundle, which she thrust through the bars of an open window, which she knew ventilated a cellar. Last of all, she stripped her gloves and sent them after the bundle. She heard the voices of the nurse and attendant as they carried the child to the ambulance. "Poor little kid," she murmured. "I hope he gets better." And strangely enough, she meant it. It had been a thrilling evening for Lydia, and she returned to the house at Cap Martin very tired but happy. She was seeing a new world, a world the like of which had never been revealed to her. And though she could have slept, and her head did nod in the car, she roused herself to talk it all over again with the sympathetic Jean. Mrs. Cole-Mortimer retired early. Mr. Briggerland had gone up to bed the moment he returned, and Lydia would have been glad to have ended her conversation, since her head reeled with weariness. But Jean was very talkative, until... "My dear, if I don't go to bed, I shall sleep on the table," smiled Lydia, rising and suppressing a yawn. "I'm so sorry," said Jean. She accompanied the girl upstairs, her arm about her waist, and left her at the door of her dressing-room. A maid had laid out her night things on the big settee, a little to Lydia's surprise, and she undressed quickly. She opened the door of her bedroom. Her hand was on a switch when she was conscious of a faint and not unpleasant odor. It was a clean, pungent smell. "Disinfectant," said her brain mechanically. She turned on the light, wondering where it came from, and then as she crossed the room she came in sight of her bed and stopped, for it was saturated with water that dropped from the hanging coverlet and made little pools on the floor. From the head of the bed to the foot there was not one dry place. Whosoever had done the work was thorough. Blankets, sheets, pillows were soddened, and from the soaked mass came a faint, acrid aroma which she recognized, even before she saw on the floor an empty bottle labeled peroxide of hydrogen. She could only stand and stare. It was too late to arouse the household, and she remembered that there was a very comfortable settee in the dressing-room with a rug and a pillow, and she went back. A few minutes later she was fast asleep. Not so Miss Briggerland, who was sitting up in bed, a cigarette between her lips, a heavy volume on her knees, reading. "Such malignant cases are almost without exception rapidly fatal, sometimes so early that no sign of the characteristic symptoms appear at all," she read, and dropping the book on the floor extinguished her cigarette on an alabaster tray and settled herself to sleep. She was dozing when she remembered that she had forgotten to say her prayers. "Oh, damn!" said Jean, getting out reluctantly to kneel on the cold floor by the side of the bed. Chapter 18